All right, hello environmental science. Today we're going over 5.4, the impacts of agricultural practices. I'm Mr. S, your teacher for the day, and this is a topic that is really near and dear to my heart because that's what I studied in college. So, the objectives are to describe agricultural practices that cause environmental damage. Okay, so hopefully you know the major things that in agriculture that damage the environment. And the essential knowledge is for you to know the agricultural practices that can cause environmental damage, including tilling, slash and burn farming, and the use of fertilizers. And we're going to be talking, practicing concept explanation, so describing environmental concepts and processes at the end. All right, so here is monocropping. Mono always means one, and it's when there's just one huge field with one crop. So corn, wheat, and soy, you see farms with like 60,000 acres of corn, right? A good thing about this type of agriculture, which is the major type of agriculture in the United States and in a lot of wealthier countries, is that it's extremely efficient for harvesting pesticide and fertilizer application. And it's only getting more efficient for those things, okay? Because they use GPS and they can tell exactly which areas need the fertilizer. They can actually scan the leaf and see how much fertilizer there needs to be. The watering, everything is extremely efficient. So a lot of people argue this is the best way to go to feed humanity because it's so efficient. The bad things are that it greatly decreases biodiversity. So, and there's more pests and fewer natural predators, right? So if you just have one type of crop growing, then if there's one beetle that kills it, it can really cause you a lot of damage. And so for that reason, farmers will use a lot of chemicals on these kinds of land, which can pollute the water and the soil, obviously. And we lose a lot of insects, pollinators, really important organisms for our environment. Okay, and then we have increased soil erosion. So the crops are harvested all at once, and it's just really hard on the soil because it's all this huge process that gets plowed through at one time. Unless we do no-till farming, which we'll talk about. And finally, it also decreases habitat diversity for species. So this is similar to the decreases overall biodiversity, but there's less habitats for all sorts of different organisms. Okay, so plowing and tilling is predominantly used in agriculture, and it turns the soil upside down, pushes down the crop residues, and puts them into the soil and kills weeds and insects. This increases erosion because it loosens the soil, and we've learned a little bit of erosion, but it takes 1,000 years to rebuild that soil. So it's one of our most precious resources. And it exposes organic matter to oxygen, which increases CO2 in the atmosphere. And this soil degradation, along with irrigation and overproduction, these things are irreversible and a really threat to the future of our species. You see here, this is where there's intensive tillage, and they're really churning up the soil every time, compared to no-till, where they use mostly chemicals to kill off the remaining plants and plant right into the stubble or the leaves on the surface. And you have just a lot more pores, the water goes through, the soil remains intact, even if they are using chemicals. So a lot of farmers are moving towards this. All right, another harmful aspect of how agriculture affects the environment is slash and burn agriculture. So this looks like Amazonias, but all over the world, people will cut down trees and vegetation, burn them, and then the nutrients the ash provides nutrients to the soil. But think if you can remember what biome, nutrient poor soil and warm climate. We talked about this in biomes, how the soils are really poor, so this actually doesn't really do that much. And this is not sustainable. This just destroys the ecosystem, obviously. But it is a major, major thing that's happening all over the world as populations grow. And then this releases a ton of carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide that's stored in those plants, which leads to erosion, loss of topsoil to hold up roots, and positive feedback cycle. So the irrigation may lead to salinization as well, as we kind of learned about at the very beginning of the year in the salinization lab, which eventually leads to desertification, which is when land is rendered completely unproductive. So it may be difficult to equate irrigating crops with fresh water and salinization, but even if fresh water has a certain amount of salts in it, when it evaporates, it leaves behind those salts. And what happens over and over is that salt builds up in the soil. So even normal water in the soil, as it's evaporating, it leaves behind salts. And that's a global issue. And then these are the rates of deserts. And we can see that, you can see where we are. There's a lot of areas that are vulnerable to desertification due to overgrazing and agricultural practices. A lot of the US, but all over the world. The Sahara Desert is expanding at a rate of 30 miles a year. All right, and then just more about the Amazon rainforest burning. Deforestation in the Brazilian Amazon hit a new high in the first 4 months of this year in 2020. And that was a 55% increase from the same period last year, the highest figure for the first 4 months of the year since records began. So this is due to Bolsonaro and the government there, who are really going in favor of economics of farming. And the last, fertilizers. So there are large amounts required to replace the last organic matter and nutrients. Nitrogen, potassium, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are what are replaced. And if it's an organic farm, they mostly use manure. They also use fish, emulsified fish, so blended fish on organic farms. And then synthetic inorganic fertilizers. This combustion of natural gases fixes and captures atmospheric nitrogen. So remember in the nitrogen cycle, organic fertilizers feed the soil and then feeds the microorganisms that bring in the microbes to feed the plants, whereas a synthetic fertilizer just feeds the plants, and therefore there's a lot more leaching and a lot more pollution. A few more slides. The benefits of this is that they can easily be absorbed. The content can be adjusted and targeted for different crops or soils, and without synthetic fertilizers we cannot feed the world. So basically the scientist who figured out how to do this was a Nazi scientist who was testing how to gas Jewish people and other races. And he figured out how to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix it into a fertilizer. And when he did that, it has the single most significant thing that's happened in science in terms of the population exploding to what it is today. It wouldn't be possible without the fixation of nitrogen in the Norman-Borlaug process, which I find fascinating and really dark. Nitrogen fertilizer use in the United States has gone up, a lot of it for corn. All right. And finally, these are the environmental drawbacks. We get algae blooms, right? And so we'll talk about that, but it uses a huge amount of fossil fuel energy to create. It's carried by runoff to groundwater and waterways. And it allows you to not have organic matter being added to the soil, which helps raise the cation exchange levels and water retention abilities. So how much nutrients and water the soil can hold. So, and that runoff causes algae blooms like you see here, which gets rid of all the oxygen and kills all life. All right, thanks for listening. See you next time.